Hey there! Welcome to Belle Meade Historic Site, my home. Belle Meade means beautiful meadow, and that is a great depiction of what it truly is. My name is Bonnie Scotland, and I'd like to show you around this amazing farm and tell you the story of the people who lived here and worked here back in the 1800s. I myself came to this beautiful place in 1871, but I'll get to my story as we walk. In the meantime, saddle up as we gallop to our first stop on the tour. As we begin, it's important to remember the full history of this land. While the Belle Meade story doesn't begin until 1807, the story of this land goes back much further. For centuries, this land was lived on by Native Americans, including the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasha, Creek, and Shawnee tribal nations, among others. This land was their home until they were forced to leave Middle Tennessee because of unfair treaties and wars. Even though the Native American tribes no longer occupy this land, their story is linked to my story because we all lived here at one time or another. Anytime I tell folks about the history of Belle Meade, I always start by honoring the first people to live here. Now this creek is called the Richland Creek, and it brought water to the animals and all the people who've ever lived on this land, including John Harding and his family. And that's where our story starts. Welcome to the Harding cabin. This cabin originally belonged to John Harding and his wife Susanna. In 1807, John Harding bought 250 acres of land right along the Richland Creek. The Hardings lived in the cabin, which was built by the enslaved workers whom John Harding brought here. In fact, all three of the Harding children were probably born here, and they lived here until 1820 when their brick home was finished. During those early frontier years, life was a little rougher around the edges, as most everything had to be produced on the farm. In addition to farming and raising animals, there was a blacksmith shop for making tools and a grist mill for grinding flour. All of the labor was done by enslaved people, like Dicey, who was the cook, Patrick, who might have built this house, and Ben, who was a blacksmith. There were many other people who worked here over the years, and we'll talk more about them as we go. In fact, this cabin would one day become the home of a man named Bob Green, who was the head horse trainer here in later years, but we're not quite to his part of the story yet. Now, the year 1816, while John Harding was still living in this cabin, was a big year, as far as I'm concerned, because that was when the Belle Meade stud business began. Harding put an ad in the Nashville Banner saying that his stallion was ready to breed, and that brought the horse business to Belle Meade. Harding was a busy fella, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's move on to our next stop. This beautiful brick building is a building we call the gardener's house. When it was first built in the 1820s, it was used for storing food, but over time, other spaces were built for that, and this little structure became a great storage area for gardening tools. That made a lot of sense, especially once the pit-style greenhouse was added by the 1850s. The greenhouse, one of the first of its kind in Tennessee, was built about halfway underground, so it uses the earth for insulation. In this case, it stays warm because the roof of the greenhouse was built with 5 glass panels at a slope. This allows all the sunlight to shine against the inside bricks all day long, and the bricks just soak up all that heat, keeping this space nice and toasty and perfect for growing plants. It's pretty likely that William Giles Harding, John's son, brought the idea of building a pit-style greenhouse home with him from college. He went to the American Literary, Scientific, and Military Academy in New England, where greenhouses like this were more common. The next place we are going was also built in 1820. Can you guess where we are going next? I will give you a hint. Hopefully our next stop's information won't slip your mind or make you feel ice-elated, but if you do, I might have to igloo you back together. As you think about where we are going next, follow me down the hill. Did you guess where we were going? Have you ever heard of an ice house? Well, you have now, because that's where we are. This round building is a reproduction. Do you know what that means? It means this exact building is not the original ice house, but was built to reproduce the look of the original. My friends at the Belle Meade Museum built this reproduced ice house in 2019, about 200 years after John Harding had his original ice house built in 1820. Back then, if you were to open the door, you'd have to be super careful not to fall down into the hole. This building was constructed in such a specific way, round with a large hole in the ground inside, in order to store ice blocks. Like the greenhouse, this underground construction uses the earth for insulation, but instead of using glass panels to let in lots of light and stay warm, it was built with limestone blocks and no windows. This keeps the sunlight and heat away from the ice stored inside. The roundness of the building means there are no corners, so all the ice melts slowly and at the same rate. You might be wondering where the ice came from. It was shipped down south on the railroads in large wooden crates packed with sawdust. The ice was harvested in large blocks from rivers and lakes way up in the northernmost part of the United States. You can bet this was expensive to buy and to store. Having ice like this was a luxury that most people at the time did not have access to. The Civil War brought a stop to most of the trade that was done between the North and the South, and it also brought a lot of changes to the American economy. In the years after the Civil War, many more factories were built throughout the South, including an ice factory built in Nashville in the early 1880s. Once there was a local ice factory, the family at Belle Meade no longer needed to store large blocks of ice, so the ice house was torn down and the stones reused in another building we'll see later. Now we are going to hoof it to our next stop, which would be considered smoky. See if you can guess our next stop. Welcome to the Smokehouse. This started as a one-story structure built in 1826, but a second story was added later because a taller building meant more room for more meat. You see, a smokehouse is not used only for storing meat year-round, but also for salt curing and smoking meat. Here at Belle Meade, the primary meat of choice was pork. The hams were covered in salt, wrapped up, and then hung from the rafters inside. Before the Civil War, the young enslaved boys would climb the rafters to hand the meats up and down. How dangerous! After the hams were hung, a smoky fire would be lit on the floor of the smokehouse for a day or two. After that, the hams were kept in the smokehouse to cure. That means the people just left the hams hanging around for several months, especially through the hot summer, which lets the moisture evaporate and the smoky, salty flavor get more concentrated. Apparently, the Hardings and their friends loved that. I'd rather have an apple. But anyway, at this size, the smokehouse could store up to 20,000 pounds of meat. Over the years, this building played a huge part in Belle Meade's famous hospitality. The amount of food that would be ready for any guest that came to the farm was shocking. In the years after the Civil War, this hospitality would be linked with the horse business, when the family hosted huge barbecue feasts along with their public horse auctions. Well, let's keep moving. Our next stop on the tour is the enslaved cabins, just down the hill from here. This particular log cabin was built in 1830, but it was originally on another farm. It was brought to the museum several decades ago because the Belle Meade cabins no longer exist. Cabins for enslaved workers were often very small and would be crowded. Cabins like this one had 2 rooms with a big fireplace in the middle. A whole family, or around 10 people, might sleep in one room. Usually on slaveholding farms like Belle Meade, the cabins for the enslaved people would be arranged in a big square or in rows. On some farms, you might find small garden plots near these cabins, where enslaved workers would spend the hours after their forced work was over each day gardening to produce extra food. Sometimes, in this area of the farm, you might spot very young children playing, although on most farms, including Belle Meade, enslaved children as young as 4 or 5 years old would be expected to work. As you know, there were people enslaved here by the Harding family since the farm started in 1807. By the time the Civil War started in the 1860s, there were over 130 enslaved people living on this farm. But the end of the Civil War finally brought the end of slavery and freedom to the many workers who lived here. Some of the newly freed men and women moved away to other places, looking for new opportunities and a fresh start. Others chose to stay here, where they had lived most of their lives. The important thing to remember is that finally, at long last, the workers at Belle Meade got to choose for themselves where they wanted to live. One man who moved to a new home but kept working for Belle Meade was my good friend Bob Green. You might remember I mentioned him way back at the beginning of the tour because he eventually lived at least part-time in John Harding's old cabin. He had started life as an enslaved baby at Belle Meade, but by the time freedom came, he was a grown man and was very skilled at working with horses like me. I've got loads more to tell you about Mr. Green, but we gotta keep moving. I'll stop horsing around and get us to our next stop, the Belle Meade Mansion. While we are walking to this beautiful home, let me catch you up on what was going on in the Harding family. Remember all those buildings that John Harding was building back in the 1820s? Well, he also had a big brick house built for his family too. His kids grew up, and by 1838, he was ready to retire. So his son, William Giles, took over the running of the farm because old John retired. William Giles married Elizabeth McGavick, and they had 2 children. By this time, the Harding family had become one of the wealthiest families in the area, and William Giles was deeply involved in breeding and racing thoroughbreds, like myself. I guess William Giles thought maybe the original house wasn't fancy or big enough for the kind of business he wanted to do, because he doubled the size of the house in 1853 with the Greek Revival touch. Do you know what that means? Well, when we get there, look for the big columns on the front porch. They're supposed to remind you of an ancient Greek temple. Check out those limestone columns. As impressive as the outside of the mansion is, the interior is just as beautiful. Now, I've never seen it, of course, since they don't let horses inside for some reason, but I hear the ceilings of the first floor are 14 feet tall. And the first room visitors see is a huge entrance hall that runs the full length of the house. On the walls of the entrance hall, there are many paintings of thoroughbreds, painted by some of the great horse portrait painters of the 1800s, like Edward Troy. Now, I don't like to brag, but I'm featured in an important painting with the one and only Bob Green that hangs right in the center of that room. But we aren't to that part of the story yet, so hold your horses. Now, it wasn't long after William Giles completed the expansion of his home that the tensions between the North and the South got worse. And when the Civil War officially began in 1861, he put a hold on the horse business and instead focused on his support of the Confederacy. The next year, in 1862, there was fighting in Nashville. In fact, the fighting was so close to the house that the adults on the farm gathered up the enslaved children and took them about a mile up the road from here for their protection. After that battle, which the Confederate Army lost, William Giles Harding was arrested and spent a few months in a Michigan fort. Well, there's more to tell you, believe it or not, so we better keep moving. Speaking of 1862, this little building was built that year. It's a chicken coop, so you can probably guess what happened in here. This is where the chickens would be kept and the eggs were collected. The cooks in the kitchen would serve the eggs to the family and their guests in cakes, pastries, or just scrambled. Do you remember how I mentioned a woman named Dicey, who was an enslaved cook here way back in 1807? Well, she was still mentioned as being here right up until the time of the Civil War, so it's possible she saw this building being built. Another woman who definitely saw this structure and likely came in here to collect eggs then was Susanna Carter. She was also enslaved by the Harding family and worked in the house. But by 1865, Susanna Carter, Bob Green, and all the enslaved people were freed once the 13th Amendment was passed. The end of the Civil War and slavery changed a lot for Belle Meade, but if you think that that's the end of the story, you'd be wrong. Why, we haven't even gotten to my part of it yet. A few years later, William Giles' daughter, Celine, married a man named William Hicks Jackson, and he moved here and began to assist Mr. Harding with restarting the horse business. The next part of the tour is my favorite. Saddle up, partner, for the story of how I came to Belle Meade. As we are walking to our next stop, I'm going to tell you about myself and my favorite trainer, Mr. Bob Green. I was born in Great Britain in 1853 and did a little horse racing while over there. I even won a few races, but a leg injury cut my racing days short, and before long, I found myself over here in the United States. I bounced around to a couple of farms across the country, but by 1871, I was living here at Belle Meade. While I was a decent racehorse, my claim to fame is that my sons and daughters are some of the best racehorses around today. Even back during the 1800s, they were setting records for the number of races won, and my descendants are still winning. Have you heard of Secretariat or Seabiscuit? What about American Pharoah, California Chrome, or Barbaro? Well, those amazing racehorses all came from my bloodline, plus many more. Between you and me, I am a little bit of a celebrity around here. I could go on, but we're running out of time, and I wanted to tell you more about Bob Green. I know I've mentioned him a few times already, but he's pretty important as far as I'm concerned. Bob Green was enslaved by the Hardings here at Belle Meade back before the Civil War, but afterward he worked for the Jacksons. He was an expert when it came to working with me and my horse friends. He knew just about everything there was to know about how to keep a horse healthy and make a horse run fast. His work made a huge difference for the success of the Belle Meade farm. I could whinny about how amazing Bob Green and I were all day, but we gotta move on. We are getting close to the end of our time together, but I think you will love our next stop. This little house was built in 1870, a year before I arrived at Belle Meade. General William Hicks Jackson, who had married Celine Harding, built this for their 3 children. You see, by the late 1800s, children were encouraged to play often and to play outside. Little playhouses like this one were common among wealthy families, like the Jacksons, especially because their children had the luxury of free time. Working-class children would not have time for this kind of fun. But it wasn't all fun and games, even for the Jackson kids. When they weren't playing, they would have to study. When they were young, they had tutors in the home to teach them lessons, but eventually all 3 attended boarding schools. As he grew up, General and Celine Jackson's son, William Harding Jackson, prepared to help his father with the business. I'll be telling you what happened to him in just a moment, but first, we have another stop to make. This one will be butter than the rest, cheesier than some, and when we get there, you will want to milk it for all it's worth. Can you guess where we are going next? See if you can race me there. 3, 2, 1, go! Oh, shucks, you beat me here. Did you guess right? We are at the Dairy Building. This space was constructed in 1884, and some historians believe that some of the limestone blocks used here were originally part of the ice house that was taken down a few years earlier. The dairy's walls were constructed out of ashlar limestone that were 2 feet thick. Maybe you're wondering why they needed this building. Well, not only was the Harding-Jackson family thriving in breeding horses, but they also launched a dairy company in the years after the Civil War. You see, back before the Civil War, when the Hardings relied on enslaved labor, all the butter made on this farm was churned by enslaved children. But after emancipation, which means freedom, when slavery was finally abolished, the Jacksons decided to invest in a steam-powered butter churn. That was a big investment, but Jackson knew that with a machine, he could get enough butter to sell and make up the cost of the machinery, eventually turning a profit. In 1888, 20 to 40 cows were milked each week, and each cow's weekly milk could make 4 to 6 pounds of butter. That's a lot of butter. General Jackson hired people to drive his dairy wagon around town, delivering milk, cheese, and butter to the people of Nashville. It wasn't long before the dairy business was making almost as much money as horses around here. Speaking of horses, we're not quite done talking about them. Let's head up to our last stop on the tour, which is the Carriage House and Stables. Welcome to our last stop on the tour, and one of my favorites. This is the Carriage House and Stables. This building was built in 1892 and cost about $30,000 to construct, which was a lot of money back then. This carriage house was considered by some to be one of the finest in the U.S. The building's primary purpose was to house the family's carriages, like a garage, but it was much more than that. There was a second floor which was used for storage, but also groomers and visiting house trainers could stay there as well. The carriages are interesting, of course, but I like the stables better. The stables are in the back part of the building, and that's where you can find 14 individual horse stalls. Each one of those stalls had gas lights and running water. Talk about fancy for a barn in the 1800s. Now, this building wasn't built for the racing horse, like me, but for the riding and carriage horses. All of us racing horses had our own acre of land to run, play, and train in addition to a special barn for foaling newborn baby horses, a training stable, a sale barn, and lots more. It sure was a horse's dream, but it eventually came to an end. You see, by the early 1900s, horse racing wasn't as popular as it had been in earlier years, so General Jackson's son, William Harding Jackson, had some ideas for growing the business in other ways, kind of like his dad had done with the butter and his great-grandfather had done with the blacksmithing. But sadly, it wasn't to be. Both General Jackson and his son passed away in 1903, and after that, the rest of the family decided it was best to just close up the old farm. But, as you now know, the Belle Meade story didn't end there. There are still descendants of the many people who worked on this farm, both enslaved and free, descendants of the Harding and Jackson families, and descendants of the horses living and thriving. And that's not all. Now, this beautiful meadow is a special museum where visitors from all over the world can come to hear about American history. Wait, did y'all hear that? I think I hear someone pouring grain into my feed bin. That must mean it's time to eat, and I do not want to be late. Thanks for coming along with me on this tour. I have to move on, but I hope to see you real soon at Belle Meade Historic Site.